Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Wild Woman podcast. I'm so excited today. I have I think I'm in the company of greatness. I'm always in the company of greatness on
Oh.
this podcast, but I really feel it today. I feel very honored and very privileged to have the world internationally known astrologer Melanie Reinhart, who I'm sure many of you will have heard of. I know many listeners are into astrology, some aren't at all, and I just feel so grateful to have such a beautiful woman, but someone who has been so immersed in astrology all her life, and she might take us on a little bit of that journey. Because in my experience, I have just been opened up to astrology really in the last few years, guided to it. I'm a very, very amateur but enthusiastic student, and I think I will be till the day I die now that I've found it. And it just can really, I think, particularly now at the time we are on the planet, it offers so much hope. And I think also this sort of feeling of interconnected, not feeling, knowing of how interconnected we all are. We all need each other. We're integral pieces of this puzzle of life. And when we get that, I think anything is possible. We can change and we can move forward in a very new and hopeful um, way. But just to tell you a little bit about Melanie before I introduce her properly. So she's best known for her book Chiron and the Healing Journey, and I hope we get to touch on Chiron a little bit, the Wounded Healer, today, because I think it's very relevant as well for the times we're living in. Um, and she is also a prize-winning diploma holder of the Faculty of Astrological Studies in the UK, of whom she is also a patron. And she was awarded the prestigious Charles Harvey Award in 2004, given by the Astrological Association of Great Britain for exceptional service to astrology. Her work is an unusual combination of intuition and meticulous research. And I love that we were talking a little bit about that, or Melanie was just before we hit record. And we might talk a little bit about that as well. And Melanie, she has connections with Ireland, which is very interesting and very near to where the town where my grandmother, who's very alive in my life these days, even though she's passed away quite a number of years, in Northern Ireland. Yeah, so that's very interesting how we're all the web, the tangled web we weave. Which Melanie was born in Zimbabwe, and when I read this sentence, I thought it was so beautiful. Whose night sky inspired her vocation of astrology at an early age, and she began studying the ancient wisdom traditions at the age of 10. So maybe we might just start there for a moment, Melanie, if you wouldn't mind just sharing
Sure.
whatever feeling relevant. Firstly, welcome, and I'm deeply grateful to you for being a guest today.
Well, thank you so much, Celine, for inviting me. And I love the ancestral connection. It's even specific to a particular town, Trillick.
Acrylic, yes, yes, I should
So
have said.
that's where my grandmother, so maternal grandmother, was married in Trillick and came from a little town very nearby that. And
My
that
grandmother
that very
also.
town,
In that very town, my grandmother was born there in
Yes.
1899, I think my mother said. Yeah, 1899.
Wow.
I know it's really you couldn't plan it. You
Exactly.
couldn't, just couldn't. Um, but yeah,
I like to think that because this is about my grandmother and your grandmother.
mm,
So I would like to imagine them maybe sitting somewhere having tea together, being as they've got a connection to the same little town,
yes.
and sort of maybe looking down and saying, "Oh, I think be nice if these two met," meaning you and me.
The power of it, which I suppose when we talk about astrology, the influence of the skies as above, so below, it's sort of
Yes, indeed.
where the power or lies. But would you mind starting just because I think it's something that's come up a lot with nearly every guest, and I think it's very helpful for anyone listening if they are struggling or unsure what's going on in my life. Sometimes when we can go back to childhood and some of the gifts and the things that were lit us up, even though we may
Yes.
forget, can help us find the thread in our lives again and pick it up to move
Yes,
forward. Um,
absolutely. Well, you know, I have still vivid memories of the African night sky, and in particular, a memory of lying on my back at night, looking up at the Southern Cross. Now, anyone who's traveled in this or lives in the Southern Hemisphere, you will know how incredibly prominent is the Southern Cross in the southern skies. And, you know, it's been well known as a navigational device through all different cultures and down the ages. But what I didn't know at that time was the fact that the Southern Cross lies directly under the belly of the massive constellation of Centaurus. Now, that is the constellation which represents the immortalized Chiron. So after Chiron died, he was immortalized in this constellation. And you know, I didn't even make that connection until quite late on in my study of Chiron, and I just was
yeah.
flabbergasted. And to me, that's such a wonderful example of how all these magical threads of events and connections and so forth, you know, we live in a mesh of that, and sometimes we don't even see it. And then sometimes we do. It was my dear friend and colleague, Brian Clark, who, an astrologer, who was living and working in Australia, where, of course, the Southern Cross is a feature of their skies as well. And he was the one that pointed out the Centaurus connection with me, and I was speechless, gobsmacked. And to think that, you know, in my childhood, there I was lying on my back on the ground in Africa, looking up at the sky, at the very constellation which symbolizes a being, namely Chiron, who I would spend, you know, decades of my life studying and being engaged with. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
You couldn't know.
And, you know, in my experience, certainly that phrase, you couldn't make this up, is something regularly appropriate to say and be used in astrology, because you do really get to see this whole web of connections, sometimes with such clarity and sometimes even quirky humor. And all you can do is just say, you couldn't make this up. You really couldn't. And so, and I remember my father pointing out different constellations to me, but I don't remember. And obviously pointing out the Southern Cross, but I don't remember him pointing out Centaurus. But I do remember that when I was 9, I fell and broke my arm really badly. And it was broken high up on the humerus bone. And there's a pun there, it wasn't funny. And so the wound wouldn't heal. Again, you can't make this up. The wound wouldn't heal and wouldn't heal. And I was put in a massive plaster cast with my left arm stuck out like that, and a body cast from the neck to the hip.
Oh my
for
God.
months and months because they tried certainly twice, maybe 3 times to get the bone to set. And then they had to wait 6 weeks to see if it had taken, and it didn't take. And eventually I had a major surgery and had a big steel rod put down in the bone, and then a year later that was taken out. But I needed a lot of rehab because I'd been so long in plaster that, my elbow seized up and spine got very weak and all this kind of stuff. So it was during that period of time, which was really quite traumatic. So I stayed home from school a lot, which from one point of view, I didn't mind at all. From another point of view, it was like I was ripped out of my usual social milieu into a lot of isolation. And, I couldn't ride my bicycle. There was many, many physical things I just couldn't do. But during that period of time, I used to waddle in my plaster cast down the road to the local library. And this was the National Library of Southern Rhodesia, as it was then. And because it's mainly, and still is, mainly an agrarian economy, most of the library consisted of books about stock raising and all kinds of agriculturally related things. And there was one shelf labeled philosophy, psychology, and religion. One shelf, so maybe
Oh.
1.5 meters maximum. And on that shelf, I found all kinds of books. So there weren't that many, but they were the kind of books that if you read any of them deeply enough, it would open all kinds of doors, So some works by Freud, some by Jung, the Bhagavad Gita, other things, and including some works about theosophy. Actually, a few years ago, I rebought a copy of the book on theosophy, whose title I did remember. But it was there that I found a small book on astrology. And I can still vividly remember I had the book propped up on my arm, which was in a plaster cast. I opened this little book and began to read, and I just had this feeling of indignation and kind of disappointment somewhere, because I absolutely knew that there was way more to astrology than what was written in this little book. Sadly, I don't remember the name of that little book or the author. Rack my brains, it's gone. Anyway, somewhere I was just captivated. So it was a book only about the sun signs. And I memorized, so I would know which sun sign belonged to which part of the year and all the descriptions of the character and all that. And then I simply asked everybody I met when their birthday was. And I would try to guess, what the sun sign was, or whether I asked them questions. And that just became part of my life everywhere I went. Even my parents' friends, to their embarrassment. But I was living in a milieu that was war-torn. All through that period, there was guerrilla war, building up to the War of Independence, which was declared in 1965. I then went to university in Cape Town in South Africa, and a friend gave me a copy of Dane Rudyhar's book. I have the very book, the very, very book. Doesn't come out too well. It's called The Pulse of Life.
Oh, I love that title. The Pulse of
Yeah,
Life.
no, I know, The Pulse of Life.
Oh
It
my
like
God.
says it all. That's right. Okay, next, please. That's it. So I was given that book for a birthday. I think it was my 19th birthday. And it's a book only about the sun signs. But it's like everything you always wanted to know about the sun signs, but didn't even know what to ask. And I still remember opening it, of course, at my own sun sign, which is Gemini, and just feeling overcome with emotion and stunned with disbelief, because the paragraph that my eyes landed on, in fact, let me find it, just
Do please.
find the very paragraph. But I just had this experience of feeling, oh my God, this man who I've never met, I did meet him later, that's another story, but this man who I've never met knows me better than my own parents do, or better than I even do myself. So the book is by Dane Rudyhar, who sometimes is called the father of modern astrology. Remarkable kind of Renaissance man who was born in France in the late 19th century. Yeah. And he was also a musician and a writer and artist. And his revisioning of astrology has actually been central to the development of astrology as it has gone in the 20th and 21st century. So a lot of the really fundamental ways of understanding astrology were first articulated by Dane Rudyhar. And that's long enough ago where I can remember how shocked I was when I first was coming across students who were talking about different things that were really quantified and described by Dane Rudyhar, and they'd never even heard of him. So we're talking fairly ancient history now already. But anyway, I've found, so he describes the zodiac in terms of what he calls the day force and the night force. And this is linked with the seasonal picture of the northern hemisphere, and how much light there is during the daytime and so forth. And so, well, we've just had a summer solstice in the north. So the days get longer and longer and the nights get shorter and shorter. And then that shifts at the summer solstice and the night force begins to increase again. Okay. And it's a beautiful way of understanding the year. And by the way, for any of you who are living in the southern hemisphere, fret not, because ultimately this extraordinary map has to do with the movements and the unfoldings within the soul. And that's not defined by our geography. So the zodiac to me is a description of the journey of the soul. And it just so happens that in the regions where that was codified or formularized, they were in the northern hemisphere. So don't make the mistake of thinking that if you live in a place where the seasons don't match the signs, not a problem. So, because I was living in the southern hemisphere. So let me read the bit.
Please.
So this is to do with Gemini, and we only just left Gemini.
Yeah.
At
Just left.
our time of talking. Yeah. So this is what Rudyhar says. So any Geminis out there watching, this is for you. Okay? So the individual filled with the energy of the day force tends to be overwhelmed by the complexity of his personal experience. There is so much that is felt touched, dimly sensed. The world is so full of flowers, the nights so sparkling, the fire of self flames forth in such intricate designs of living that some definite order must be evolved at any cost. If the budding personality is not to be shattered by the very vividness of this extension of being. So
Wow.
if you ever come across descriptions of Gemini that speak about, oh, Geminis are fickle and changeable, and they can't commit, and they can be tricky, and they don't always tell the truth, and all that kind of stuff, remember this. So in that book, which, by the way, is available free online, it's been out of print for a long time, you might be able to pick up a used copy,
Very
The
good.
Pulse of Life, but it's available online at the website and free to read on the website chaldea.com, KHALDEA.com. You can find the whole thing there online, which is marvelous.
Marvelous. I will include that, yeah, for listeners. That is,
Fantastic.
yeah.
And I believe that there is a publisher who may be in the process of republishing the whole thing, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, stay tuned for that. And if you can pick up a used copy, well, bravo.
Yeah. I love what you say about reading something that you wouldn't even have known how to ask the question to.
Exactly.
It just wakes up, as you described there, something about bringing order to all of this that's arising. I straight away think of Geminis, I know, and that sort of makes sense. Like I can nearly feel it. It's
Yes,
that
yes.
really, isn't it? You're sort of, I don't know, it just feels like that it's, yeah, how would you describe, even just to start there, because there could be listeners who are not, maybe have just been, you talked before we record, came on record about, the sort of commercialization of astrology and that's, but the true, from your life and work with astrology, how would you share it with someone now who's coming to you going, I've never heard even of the word astrology? Like, what would you say it can offer them? How would you communicate or articulate what it can bring to our lives?
Well, I would say that astrology, um, words fail, right? But really, it concerns humanity's relationship with the sky, the celestial realms. And through the ages, that's been articulated in all manner of different ways. But it's always something special. Humanity has looked skyward towards the sublime and the sacred, looked there for guidance, for inspiration, and that can be also trickled down, so to speak, by an understanding of star patterns and their timing through the year, giving guidance as to when to plant crops, for example, or when to move animals, and so forth. And so those very ancient agricultural and survival uses for the information derived from the sky, if we extend that, because that's not just a metaphor, that's something very practical.
Mm,
We extend that into a metaphor, it's also about the tilling of the soil of the soul in our inner life. And so it offers thereby like a mirror in which our own personal, deeply intimate feelings about our own life, about others, what we think, what our beliefs are, and all those kind of facets of the diamond that is our individual self and how we connect with the world at large and the cosmos. Astrology is a language developed over millennia, we know that, which can speak to our own experience and can sometimes guide us deeper into it so that the sense of connection is reinforced, restored, or healed, or made available for the first time. The felt recognition that we live embedded in a whole network of energies like a mesh. I'm thinking of the image from Hinduism of the net of Indra, and that really appeals. So, coming down to things very practical, in the unlikely event of meeting somebody who's never even heard the word, a really basic thing to start with that can be very illuminating is to do with the moon cycle. So most calendars these days will tell you when is the new moon and the full moon. But not so long ago, just a few decades ago, you would have to look out a specialist diary because most of them didn't have that information. And now, of course, it's all over the internet. And additionally, all over the internet, you can, if you want to, find out in which sign a new moon or a full moon is occurring. But even if you don't know the signs, there's something so powerful about consciously attuning to the cycle of the moon. Now, in fact, we can't but be in tune with the cycle of the moon because there's many aspects of our life on Earth which are directly influenced by the relationship between the sun and the moon. The tides, for example. And it's as if the moon's relationship with water is very particular. That gravitational field literally pulls the tides of the sea. And, water is actually really heavy. And, just to think about the power of that gravitational field, if you just remember how heavy, like a 6-pack of 1.5-liter bottles of water, if you're carrying that home from the supermarket, it's not nothing, it's really heavy. And then multiply that out to however many liters of water there are in the ocean, you think, wow, this is a really powerful force. So this applies to all the waters all over the earth. And our body is a huge percentage of fluid, of water. And it too does respond. So at some level, all of us are actually experiencing this attunement, even if we don't do so consciously. Now, anyone who's an avid gardener, or perhaps even a farmer, you will know about this attunement because it does affect all kinds of things to do with the natural world. It can be really fun to track that cycle consciously in terms of how you feel and what your experience is. And certainly, I think it's fairly common knowledge that things tend to intensify around the full moon. It's like all of our energies are raised, that we may have more physical energy, emotional energy certainly raised, mental energy, it's like, wow, everything's full on. The opposite of that being the new moon. So after full moon, the moon begins to wane or shrink into visible size. And then as we get down to the new moon, we enter a period often called the dark of the moon, simply meaning where you can't see the moon in the sky at night. Now, to me, this is a really interesting one because culturally speaking, basically we live in a world that doesn't get the new moon. This is when the energies all wane. And so if we were living in some mythical culture that absolutely ran things according to the moon cycle, what that might look like in this fantasy world would be that as the moon waned and the new moon began to approach, we would all be encouraged to go on retreat. We would retreat. We would go into solitude, maybe with our journal or with our most favorite music of the kind that opens doors to the inner world. We would allow ourselves to drift and to dream and to rest. So to go into that dark place and to await the beginning of the new cycle, which will happen at the new moon. So then the moon still isn't visible for a couple of days, but there'll come a time when that beautiful thin crescent will appear in the western sky of an evening. And from there, it's visually affirmed. But in the meantime, we've been through a period of rest and regeneration and refreshment and rebirth. So maybe I've described it in rather flowery language, but I promise you, if you really connect in, you will feel that. And you might even feel the moment that the new moon occurs. This is such a fun thing. I don't always feel that, but I have often felt that, particularly if you know the time of when the new moon comes. And if you can arrange to have some quiet time at that time to meditate and just sit quiet, it's basically a letting go time. So the less active you are, the better in a way. It's really about rest. But you might suddenly feel like the inflowing of the energy of the new cycle, and that is beyond thrilling if that happens. But as I say, you won't always feel it like that. But, to extend what I've just said into the practical realms is only a very short little step, For example, if you know that you've got to have a meeting with some colleagues about a work project or something where there's already been a bit of contention and so on and so forth, you won't schedule that on the morning of the new moon, of the full moon. So you won't schedule it when everybody's energies are going to be running high. And it might be more difficult to control the meeting in a fruitful way, or that the person who tends to be a troublemaker will be absolutely full on in flood. So you won't do that. You will wait until the full moon's passed. Do it the next day, or even better, a couple of days, give it a couple of days. Likewise, if you want some time off or some rest and relaxation, do it at the new moon, just before the new moon, to be in sync with those cycles. And it absolutely pays dividends, just being very practical about it. And so extending that to the fact that in astrology, we not only consider the relationship between the the Earth and the Moon, there's, of course, the sun is involved. And then there are loads of planets, and there are minor planets, and there are dwarf planets, and TNOs or trans-Neptunian objects, and so it goes on. It sometimes comes up as a question about, well, if there are all these weird things, not only planets, but all these other things, how do you know what to use? And now I'm quoting astrologer Richard Tarnas. Very specifically, it was a conference in Canterbury, a conference of the Astrological Association of Britain. And it was at Canterbury. And there was a student, there was a forum, a panel at the end, of which Richard Tarnas was part. So a young student asked with really some anxiety in her voice about, well, how do I know what to use? And by the way, that question came at a time in astrology before everything exploded and there were loads of new planets and centaurs and dwarf planets and that whole kind of zoo of things going on up there. Because before that time, she was actually referring to different techniques that one can apply to a horoscope in order to study it. And I never forgot the reply of Richard Tarnas. He said this verbatim: in astrology, you can only work with what is burnished into your soul. Wow, that to me says it all. Because you can read until you're blue in the face with it, and you really can with astrology. But it's as if information will never really connect you. And we are living in the so-called age of information. There are other ways this age could be described, but let's say age of information, that'll do. And so information on its own really doesn't take you anywhere necessarily. If information becomes knowledge, it requires more depth, more application, more discipline, and so forth. But for that to become wisdom, that's, I think, what Richard Tarnas was referring to. Allowing something to really reach the wisdom center in yourself and to awaken that. That's part of the journey of astrology, and you don't get that by remaining at the level of information. But hey, information is fun, and you
Well, you're a Gemini, you might.
exactly right.
I'm looking at it going as a Piscean. There's too much.
There's too much.
So
Yes,
I
of course.
love that sense of, oh, am I allowed to bring in my intuition now and what feels right, what's
Yeah,
burning
no.
in your
Well,
soul,
in my opinion, you have to. Otherwise, it'll just remain at the level of information. And trust me, you'll never be bored if information turns you on. There's a world of
That should be on
information
a
out there,
t-shirt.
you
That's
know,
brilliant. Yeah.
and that's great. And of course, knowledge is also good. But wisdom, that requires all of us, our feelings, our intuition, and a whole host of other qualities that we bring to it, just as you described. And because I learned astrology in such a bizarre way, really, after I came across, or after I was given a copy of Dane Rudyhar's book, a few years after that, I began to learn the technical stuff from a book, because I was always sort of in situations where there was no milieu of astrology, no classes, no teachers, no nothing, and originally no books either. So all I had was this tiny bit of information, right? and I just set about observing for myself. Well, it's like is there anything in this? Can I see, whatever. And I just wonder how I would have managed if I'd started studying astrology in England, where there's such a rich milieu, and there are wonderful astrology schools and classes. I mean, it's like everywhere. And the number of books that have been published in the last, few decades is breathtaking. So I just had this one little book, and it was just a little sunshine book. And then I had, one Dane Rudyhar, This Pulse of Life. That was one of the reasons I came over to England, was to follow the thread of astrology. And, back then, there were quite a few astrology books, but it was still possible to read pretty much everything that was easily available in astrology. Now I'm talking about the early 1970s. And it has absolutely exploded since then. There's something for everybody, right from the superficial, I'm going to say, and the trivial, which in itself can be charming and delightful. I'm not knocking it, but all the way through into quite heavy-duty academic stuff. Amazing amount of work translating ancient texts which have never been in English before. And there's also a whole strand within astrology of appreciation of the experiential level of it, just like you were referring to, Celine. Being a Pisces and having such a rich organ of feeling, you can't leave that out when you're studying. And so ways of bringing our whole self to our study makes it just unendingly rich, really.
Yeah. And have you found on that journey, Melanie, that astrology, because I'm always taking, people talk about, oh, things are being destined, but I love what you described about the sort of the cycles or the movements. And I suppose, isn't it how I see it now is it's nearly how, and you described like with the meeting and the moon and the full moon, how we participate or engage is what really is how it shows us down in the minutiae of how it'll turn out in our life. So
Yes.
not fated and destined in the specifics, other
Yeah.
than, can you talk about the relation? I think what's hugely, it just keeps coming to me now as you're speaking, for me as well as understanding ourselves, this importance of understanding our interconnectedness with everything, particularly now in the world that we're living in, and we're looking out at all of this war and chaos and pointing. I keep seeing it in my own life. It sort of shows up every time I project out and point a finger. I'm being
Yeah.
called back into where I'm doing that individually, one on one in at home,
Yes.
and going, okay, what needs to happen here? So it's the study of, what am I trying to say? The study of astrology has really started to open up to me I wouldn't say my importance sounds a big word, but the role I play in all of
Yes.
it, you know
Yes.
what I mean? And I just
Yes.
think it's so important right now. How would you talk about for that to someone to bring that? Yeah.
So what comes to mind immediately, hearing you ask about that, is a phrase of Dane Rudyhar, so the author of The Pulse of Life that I was raving on about. And this is a paraphrase, but what he says is events do not happen to people. People happen to events.
Mm.
In other words, we bring ourselves to the events that befall us.
Mm.
And in that way, our individual experience of an event, which may have happened to, 20 other people or 1,000 other people, our unique individual experience is what we bring to that. And I find that so profound, especially in these times where there are so many huge, sometimes very scary things happening, events happening on all sorts of levels, happening to a large number of people. And yet, in the view of Rudyhar, we bring ourselves, we happen to those events. And yes, events can happen to us that we didn't plan or want even. But we still bring who we are to that event. And thus, it's a unique event in our own lives.
Yeah.
This also goes some way to addressing the time-worn dilemma as regards astrology to do with free will and predestination. That was one of the reasons why astrology got a bad name and was banned by the church and so on and so forth. And in a way, I would say, understandably so. Because the last thing we need here on Earth is some kind of ideology and system which is potentially going to disempower us. We don't need that. We already got that going on down here. We don't need that up there too. But as we were talking before we went live, there's something that's really important to understand about astrology, and this is where if we are stuck in a scientific materialist view, we're not going to get it whatsoever, because it does involve other levels of experience than simply the physical. Okay. There is a level at which astrology is totally accurate. Now, I have to qualify what I just said, because here I'm not talking about prediction in the narrow way that it's usually conceived. So I'm not saying that with this accuracy I'm talking about, I'm not talking about astrology being able to predict, when the tall, dark man is going to come into your life, or, when this is going to happen or that's going to happen. I'm not talking on that level, but to the extent that astrology is a language that speaks to the unfolding mystery that we all live in, it's able to language that and bring awareness to the qualities of the energies of any particular time. And that will be accurate in terms of, it'll be as accurate as we're able to articulate. But it won't necessarily give you details at the concrete, literal, material level. The more concrete and literal and material you try to get with prediction, the more likely you will fall into error and folly, frankly. But in terms of attuning us to the flow of the energies, it's very, very accurate. And yes, there is a timing involved. And if we're okay about leaving that as an exciting mystery, well, then it's beyond stunning how absolutely spot on the timing can be and the symbolism.
Mm.
And the other thing that's a little kind of sidebar, but I think important, is that while there are all kinds of predictive techniques that do exist within astrology, for me, astrology is it is within the wisdom traditions, you know. And so we don't own them, the wisdom traditions. And to use them for reasons of power over or greed or manipulation, etc., isn't really correct. And that's a very, very subtle thing. But knowledge to do with prediction can be available on a basis of as needed. In other words, if you don't need to know something really, chances are that the astrology won't speak, or that you just won't see the obvious. But we can rest assured that this background flow of the archetypal and symbolic manifestations of the energies at work in any situation, that is astonishingly accurate. So a combination of the mystery and the precision, it's, to me, that's so thrilling. And astrology is full of paradoxes like that. And long may that be the case. Because the moment something becomes clear to the point of being mechanical, I mean, like, well, this open up a whole can of worms, but I'll say it anyway. Like AI, for example, then you know that there's a real risk of a kind of loss of soul going
Yeah.
on there,
Yeah.
because there's a way in which we need to be willing and able to leave room for the mystery to present itself. Otherwise, we just go around in our own little narrow box of what we think is true and how we think things work.
Yeah.
And so leaving room for that is really important.
When you say that, it brings me back to I had breast cancer back in 2016, but it's ended up being the most fabulously transformative, as challenging as it was, not minimizing it
Wow.
for anyone who's going through it. But
Wow.
before, what you described there, Melanie, I used to drive around in my car in my life and I was so burnt out and so, what is this? What am I doing here? What is
Yeah.
this? I felt like a machine. And it's
Yes,
just
yes.
exactly what you describe. It's like there's something, this cannot be it. Because there's something else inside of me. And it needed that. It sort of brings me to asking you because I want to share something and maybe then maybe talk a little bit of I think sort of the role of Chiron. I'm sort of still quite new in understanding this, but it's every time I listen to you, it seems to sort of reverberate in me. But that obviously, brought me to a whole different sort of like a death rebirth in a beautiful way and a challenging way as well. But what it has brought me to now, and you touched on it earlier about talking about, I suppose, the depths or the superficial or the layers of astrology, and what I'm feeling and who I'm drawn to is it's the depths that you're willing to go in yourself that reflect the
Yes.
depths that you and the chironic wound that we all have seems to be, I could be wrong, is that sort of the maybe avenue in our own way to understanding going deeper into what's available, in terms of, I'll just give you the example. It's probably an easier way to do this. So and this idea of, you said, the precision versus the mystery. So I'll share a little thing personally. I'm sure my mother won't. My poor mother, I use her, but she has, she's an older and been going through her own health difficulties and in and out of hospital. And I have been preparing, let's say, or with precision, trying to sort of, oh yeah, this is going to happen, and looking at my chart and looking at transits. And it's amazing what you described there, because each time something has transpired, but it has never been what I thought it was going to be, if you know what I mean. And I go,
Yeah,
okay, back up again for air, here we go. And then I'm
yes,
looking again and go, oh my God. And it's amazing and magical watching what it is. And I go, oh, how magnificent this universe is, how it's flowing with me and being so gentle and kind and playful in many
yes,
ways, even though it's challenging. But at the same time, and this happened to me, I literally hurt my knee yesterday, and I know how you talk about
oh,
Chiron being literal and symbolic. And I hurt my eye. I had a problem with a few weeks ago, right eye. I had a problem with my foot. And I'm saying this, just maybe people who are listening, this might as well, how we can use the astrology, as you say, so how it started to change. So I started to see, so I was running and doing a lot with precision and preparing, and I can be prepared for all of life and what it's maybe going to bring me, because at some point, like everyone, my mother will pass away and I will pass away. And but every time I went to run, I got an injury. And I was suddenly forced, well, it keeps happening, to sit and feel and
right,
go deeper into what is this bringing up. And I was brought to a layer first of resistance. I'm here with her. I've no freedom. I want to be able to. So it's like restriction, freedom, struggle. And then I went a layer beneath it in myself when I was forced to sit because I got an injury, and I sat, and I went, okay, what's going on here? What's the fear about? And it burst out of me. I'm afraid of loving her completely, because if I love her completely, I'm going to have to feel the pain of losing her. And I just thought, oh my God, that's
wow,
so profound, but so beautiful. Like it,
yeah,
and it was bringing me deeper into what is the deeper wound beyond this, because it goes back beyond my mother. Like it's bringing me,
yes,
it's really bringing me into some sort of, I've Chiron and Pisces. Sorry, I'm not using this now as an individual therapy
no,
session,
no,
but it brings life. It's the only way I can sort of, by understanding it in myself, maybe understand it in someone else when I feel it. Isn't
yes, absolutely. And, just extending what you've just said, your sensitivity to your own process and your willingness to go deep is also the very gift which you're giving to others in your podcasts, in your other work. So not only in your precious relationship with your mother, but you're managing to extend that compassion and willingness to abide with what's going on, to extend that out into the world as well, you know?
only
I
because I
think,
got a few wounds, Melanie, to slow me
yes,
down. Every time I went to run, I went, my foot, my knee. Oh my,
yeah, you couldn't make it up, right?
you couldn't make it up, exactly.
Yeah. Well, um, many people have experiences of illnesses, accidents, disasters of various kinds that do end up being like their teacher. And I use that word on purpose because I really do feel there are wisdoms that we can learn from those kinds of experiences that you don't get in any other way. And I'm not therefore saying that you must, therefore invite suffering, illness, and accidents. That I mean, that would be nuts. But it happens anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And very often, the plumbing of our own depths that's invited by those kinds of experiences can open up worlds to us. And gifts can be born into that kind of space, as obviously has happened with you. And, it's very interesting too, because you were referring to Chiron. Now, Chiron's position in the solar system, it was discovered in between Saturn and Uranus. And in fact, for part of its orbit, it actually moves in closer than Saturn is. But what's relevant about that is the fact that Saturn is the furthest planet away of the planets easily visible with the naked eye. And from Uranus outward, things are discovered using maths and technology, not naked eye observation. And so there are really two realms, broadly speaking. The realm that's visible with our normal senses, and then the world that's invisible to our normal senses. But that doesn't mean that it's a closed book or that it's not accessible. And so the opening of the doorway between those two realms, that's the zone of Chiron. And so sometimes when those doors are trying to open, an injury, an accident, or something or other happens in that zone. And from there develops a process of potential insight, understanding, of discerning the relevance of what's going on in terms of the more subtle levels of our existence, So bridging the realms between the visible and the invisible. In fact,
That's beautiful. Is that the
there's
crack is where the light gets in, isn't it? Like Rumi's words, it's that comes to
exactly.
mind.
Also, the image of the rainbow bridge
Mm.
that was used by the author Barbara Hand Clow for her book about Chiron. And she called it the rainbow bridge between the inner and the outer planets, which is just
Mm.
perfect summary of what it's about, But the role of things like illnesses and accidents and disasters of various kinds can be very precise in terms of removing us from our previous context. I mean, like what I described about when I fell and broke my arms, like I was whipped out of school, whipped out of all kinds of social things, and spent a lot of time on my own, and that can be a feature of illness, even if it's a minor thing, like maybe getting a really nasty dose of flu for a few days. If it knocks you out far enough and you take to your bed, even in one day, your reality can be altered, right?
Yeah.
And, extend that to more serious illnesses and so on. And it's like you get whipped out of where you were. And to extend that point, the role of illness and accidents and injuries and disasters and so forth in cultures that have a shamanic tradition is very central, because very often the first call to a shamanic vocation of whatever variety can be an illness, an accident, a disaster, which isolates you from the tribe in some way.
Mm.
And then working through that experience is part of what leads you to the vocation that might be indicated there, you know?
Yes.
And while not all of us are vocated to act as shamans in one way or another, I believe that all of us, every one of us, is vocated to undergo a certain unfoldment of awareness within the soul. That is the journey, as I believe anyway. And so that little metaphor, it applies across the board, whether or not it results in an actual initiation into a vocation as a way of life. But I think it holds good for everybody.
Yeah. It sounds like from earlier what you were describing with the full moon and the new moon and how, maybe you would have taken time to rest and quiet, that it's like we're overriding all these cycles so much in our world that something
Yes,
really has to happen,
exactly.
doesn't it, to
No,
mm,
absolutely. Uh,
mm,
and round the new moon, in the culture that most of us have been raised in, if new moon is approaching, you go into dark of the moon, and you can feel your energy waning,
mm,
right? Probably the first thing you do is reach for another cup of coffee, or tell yourself that you
yeah.
must go for a run around the block to get your energy up again, or you go swimming or dancing, or you talk endlessly with a friend on the phone, or you do something to kind of whip up energy. So it's like, physically, it's like giving a kick to your adrenals and saying, I
Mm,
need you,
yeah.
rather than honoring what is actually happening. And every time we override, I think it puts stress on that body soul connection, because there's a wisdom trying to guide us and we're just overriding it, kind of thing. And our culture's full of that kind of stuff, unfortunately. But we don't have to follow that. With quite simple awareness and simple choices, you can be attuning
Mm,
else.
yeah. I mean, I've definitely felt, and I haven't been consciously maybe connecting with it, but those days when you're in complete flow and the energy is just moving in you, and you only have
Yes.
to take one or two or three things, do one or two, three things, and like so much happens. And then there's another day you're slogging away up against a brick wall.
Yes.
And you go, life isn't meant to be like this. I think it's actually meant to be the other way. I should be able to lie in a hammock and do nothing. And then when the time is right, get out and be active. Like, I feel I'm being retuned or realigned in that way. And do you feel now on the planet and the way maybe the shifts that we're going through, and a lot of planets are going into Aries, and there's all this talk of so many shifts happening and a sort of
Yes.
pivotal moment in 2026 or time, I don't know, that whether we like it a lot or not, that this is, yeah, it's happening, like as I said, or like I'm finding things that I would have been able to push through, I can't. Like it's
Mm.
like the energies aren't supporting it anymore for any of
Yes.
us.
Yes, exactly.
So how would you suggest to people now who maybe are, yeah, finding that, how do we go about navigating what's happening? How can we use astrology to help us move through what we're moving through now, which is
Yeah.
challenging?
Yeah. Lovely question. Well, just to refer back to the moon cycle, which
Yeah.
is very accessible, because
Yes.
all of us experience a new and a full moon, and actually, with a little bit of effort and attention, it's very clear in our experience. But now multiply that out to remember that there we're talking about relationship between the earth and the moon. Well, in fact, sun, earth, and moon. But you can take any pair of planets and examine their cycle in a similar way. So they're going to be a waxing part of the cycle and a waning part of the cycle. Any pair, be it Jupiter, Saturn, or, any, it boggles the mind to even think about that. But that's the reality, that all these cycles between all these pairs of planets, which are going from waxing to waning and so forth. Some of them are relatively short cycles, like, the sun and moon and every month. And some are very long, like hundreds of years. Okay. But when we get to, so in astrological terms, the conjunction is the nature of the particular contact that happens, that marks the beginning of the new cycle. So referring back to the moon cycle, that's when the sun and moon are in the same place in the zodiac. Simple. And on a scale of 1 to 10, the conjunctions are the most intense of all the aspects. Okay. And they mark the beginning of the new cycle, meaning that the bit of time before before the conjunction, that's the dark of the moon equivalent. So dark of the moon in the calendar, when it's just to do with the sun and moon and earth, that only lasts a few days, right? But if we're talking about a longer cycle, it can last for years. So this is part of what's happening now. One of the key players, a duo, is the relationship between Saturn and Neptune. So in February of 2026, they will reach exact conjunction. Just one time. It can happen more times than one, but this time it's just once. So what that means, and the last time they did this was in 1989. During that, now some of us are old enough
Oh, I remember
to
1990.
remember 1989. But just as a yardstick of the intensity level we're talking about here, in 1989, there were 3 of these conjunctions of Saturn and Neptune. And it was just a few days after the third of the 3 that the Berlin Wall came down. And just a few weeks later, when they were still within range of being called conjunct, Nelson Mandela was let out of jail. So, I mean, huge historical markers. Now, I think we can't deny that for good or ill, we are seeing historical markers of all kinds. Pretty much any day you turn on the radio or the TV, whatever your media is, you'll hear about something and you go, oh my God, huge historical markers that are like epoch making, right? So in this long cycle, that's about 35 years, isn't it? Since 1989. 45.
Yes.
My maths has
No, I
departed.
think it's
But
35, isn't it? Is it? I'm thinking of what age I was in 1989, and I'm now 57. I was 21, so it's 30, probably 35.
yeah, 35.
35. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, 35 about.
And so, that's a neat, rough analogy with the moon cycle. Cycle is 29 days, say 30 days, just for the sake of this analogy. And there's only 5 of those 30 days, which comprises the dark of the moon. But if it's 35 days, 35 years, excuse me, then there's going to be way more than just the unit of 5 that comprise the dark of the moon. So this is where we are now in the cycle of Saturn and Neptune. We're at the drag ends of the outgoing cycle. And almost every person that I've mentioned this to, in terms of their own charts, just dropped in a reminder, okay, we're now at the ending of the cycle that began in 1989. And without fail, people go, oh my God, oh, that's when blah, blah, blah. That's when I had my first child, and now this and then the other, or that's when I got married, or that's when I came to England, or a year of these markers in our life, and a whole cycle ending. So we're not only just talking about history out there, as it were, it's our life flow and the markers.
Mm.
So the cycle for us that began in 1989, thereabouts, is ending now. Now,
Ah,
the
I
thing
think, yes.
about this is that when there's a long dark of the moon period, we're talking a few years now, as the beginning of the new cycle approaches, new cycle begins February 2026. So the few years leading up to that is all about the drag ends of what is actually the closing cycle. So a lot about letting go, kind of like it or not, a lot of letting go. Like, I think that nobody really lets go by choice. I know that sounds controversial because we're always being told or admonished that we just have to let go and all that. I think we can talk ourselves into thinking that we have let go when actually, when it comes to the crunch, we discover, actually, I didn't let go. I don't want to let go. I hate letting go. And that's where I am. Okay, there's a lot we have to sometimes work through.
Mm.
I feel that letting go is a kind of a grace that comes. We can prepare for that. Like, let's say that you want to declutter your house or your room. Let's say a cupboard that's keep it manageable. And you know there are things in there you need to let go of. And you rev yourself up and you think, okay, now's the day. I'm going to declutter this cupboard. And you do it. And you feel, wow, so free and so on and so forth. However, what might happen as well, there might be all kinds of reminders and mementos and souvenirs in that cupboard, which you don't really need anymore, you don't really want them anymore, but they contain the kind of sticky stuff of memory and feelings, which may ask to be honored and recognized in some way in order that sought for letting go can occur in a proper organic and natural way, not like ripping off a plaster kind of thing. So there's a whole lot of variations about how letting go and moving on occurs. Sometimes we do just have to cut the cord. We do just have to, carve ourselves away from something. But very often there is a whole process that goes with that. And sometimes the actual letting go, whether that occurs by receiving the grace of that experience or whether we really have to take firm action, that can happen quite quickly, but very often there's a long time of preparation, which may have felt very uncomfortable and a certain amount of struggle and feeling of being out of sync and so forth. That's all part of the kind of breaking down of the bits of the outgoing cycle that we're not going to take into the new cycle.
Mm.
Also, what can happen, especially with this particular pair, so Saturn is an energy of manifesting and building and also preserving, really important with Saturn. So Saturn can be seen to represent structures which are already there, which have been there forever, which may be part of a tradition, be it familial or societal or whatever, but they're part of what structures our life. That includes inwardly, Saturn can refer to what we might call ego patterns, which define who we think we are, but ultimately that's not who we really are. So any level of these structures will be kind of breaking down. Neptune, being king of the sea, is the great dissolver. So the action of Neptune is a melting, dissolving, disintegrating kind of an energy. It doesn't necessarily go with a big dramatic crash. It's more like a gentle kind of slipping away, kind of things dissolving, and then you suddenly realize, oh my God, it's gone, Now put them together and you can see that there is a huge dilemma in the contrast between them that can give rise to enormous feelings of discomfort. And on a good day, it's like if you can ride with that paradox, there's a very rich mixture of the old and the new going on at the same time. But here's another little weirdness. You might not know at first which is which. Like you might not know what is actually leaving your life forever, not going to be part of the new cycle, or whether it is going to be part of the new cycle. So that I know that sounds completely nuts. You won't know whether something is old or new. That sounds really crazy. But I think maybe at least some of you out there, you'll understand that feeling. It's like you don't know whether you're going backwards or forwards when a choice seems to come up. So this kind of process, I think, requires quite a lot of gentleness, quite a lot of patience, and I would say particularly now, because we're right coming up to the very last dregs of the old cycle. And this conjunction will occur in the sign of Aries, the very first sign of the zodiac, the beginning of a whole new cycle of action. It's a fire sign, and the movement within Aries is typically fast, impulsive, instinctive, maybe very single-minded, very action-oriented. And single-minded can also mean like tunnel vision, it has to be this and nothing else kind of thing. And can really initiate new things, get a project off the ground, and so forth, and likes to see instant results and all of that. So you can see there's all kinds of little dilemmas with the combination of Saturn and Neptune, and they're in Aries, okay? So because Neptune is an energy which often raises illusions and even delusions, where we don't see things clearly, whether we fantasize or not quite tell the difference between what we're imagining and what's actually happening. And here at the moment, if you listen carefully to the news, as they call it, you will see here plenty of examples of exactly that, where what's being touted is actually rather different than what is actually happening. So what we're told to believe is the truth may be quite far from what is actually happening. So this is a period of time where you could say the very richness of this dilemma in terms of the energies is also cautioning us that things may be not as they seem, and that includes our own perceptions of our own life. We may be kidding ourselves and so forth. So there's a lot to kind of sort through. And as well, there may be times when we do need to actually resist what feels like a strong flow towards action. That's part of the modus operandi of Saturn. Saturn can sometimes be called father time or even mother time. And there are different kinds of timing, which this gets really interesting, I think. But there can be a sense in which Saturn in Aries acts as sandbags, which may feel like a drag, an obstacle, a delay, a block. And it might indeed be just that. If it is, then it might be calling us to persist and to patiently work through what needs to be worked through, and so forth. Or it might be, it's like when you hit the wall with Saturn, if you can turn within, it sometimes happens that the wall that we thought we were up against either disappears or falls down or transforms in some way that the gate actually opens in its own time by itself. And neither approach, in other words, doggedly overcoming or just letting go of the effort and turning within, excuse me, neither one is right or wrong, but that's part of the exercise that we're called to during this time. Now, Saturn and Neptune changed their signs recently in March and in May, but they haven't gone completely all the way into Aries. They will be turning back to go for another swim in the sea of Pisces. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough.
Sure. We might be getting a little dress rehearsal, are we? We're getting get some water. It feels there's a little bit of a dress rehearsal going into Aries and then back to Pisces, is it? So before
That's
we kick
exactly
off.
right. That's exactly right.
Mm.
So, we will have a period of review of this enormous surge into the new, or maybe new doors opening, new thrusts of energy generating. We will have a period of assimilation and reflection. And as it happens, that's coming up really quite soon. So on the 4th of July, Neptune turns retrograde, meaning it appears from the earthly vantage point to be retracing its steps in its orbit, so going backwards. Similarly, Saturn on the 13th of July will do the same thing. And they will turn back again to re-enter into Aries later in the year. So Neptune will turn 10th of December and Saturn will turn 27th of November. So in other words, there's a period of a few months. So basically most of July, August, September, October, November. So there's 5 months, which is a rethinking, reviewing, reconsidering, reflecting kind of a time. And then as both of them turn direct, they move towards their exact conjunction, which is 20th of February 2026. And that's the beginning of the new cycle. Now, lest you think that the beginning of a new cycle, oh, everything's going to work out fine, and I'm going to leave all this old stuff behind, and my life will change, and all the rest of it. It's useful to remember the image of the dark of the moon that I was talking about with the moon cycle. So the new moon, the conjunction, occurs in the period of dark of the moon when you can't see the moon in the sky. and I talk quite a bit about, the energy meaning of that and so on and so forth. There's an equivalent dark of the moon that will be going on. So yes, we will be in the new Saturn-Neptune cycle, but it will still be like we can't really see it. And we're still in the metaphorical dark of the moon time. It'll take a good 18 months to 2 years before the sense of the unfolding of the consequences of what's been stirring during this time becomes more apparent and more workable with. So we're
Mm,
still very much in the process.
mm.
I know there's been a huge buildup of excitement and some fear and all that about 2026, mostly based on this. But it's not a kind of, it's not just a line that we're talking about. It's part of a whole cycle. It's a circular kind of emotion. So that's how I would see that. And so, action taken during these few months can indeed very fruitfully be to do with, yes, the closing down, closing up, whichever, of of the old cycle that is now closing in our lives. And instead of jumping immediately, because we always want the new thing, we want the new thing to come in. But if we can leave empty space, whether it's in our cupboard or in our mind, to leave some empty space into which the new can grow, those those could be wise choices at this time. Also valuing what has been and what will not be in the new cycle. That's important too, to give honor to who we've been in these last 35 years, if you're old enough. um, to give honor to who we've been and the path we've traveled, and even, ceremonialize that if that feels right for you. But certainly one's journal is a very good companion during these times, because you know how they say that first thing that happens when you die is your whole life flashes, or when you're dying, your whole life flashes before your eyes, right? Well, I'm sure that's true. But what's also true is that there are transition points in our life when that happens too, and where we may be called to do a kind of a life review, or visit old haunts, for example, or contact people we haven't seen for decades, or whatever, or just memories arising. So having a sacred place for that could be a journal. A file in your computer too can fill that purpose very well. And so that reflective mode will be soon, we'll be going into that more reflective mode. And that is a real opportunity for a taking stock and a revising, redoing, regenerating. All these words go with
Yeah.
um,
I
uh,
know they
planets are
feel they
retrograde.
appeal a lot, those at the moment to me, these re words. I can't stop saying them.
Yes,
Regenerate,
yes,
revitalize,
ab-
recharge, regroup. Re
absolutely.
It does
Because
feel,
don't
yeah.
forget, in terms of the longer arc of the Saturn and Neptune, we are in that dark of the moon equivalent time, uh, where the process of revision, of the revising, etc., that's
Mm,
an appropriate activity for this time in the general cycle.
mm. Can I ask one question, one more, and then I think we'll probably be draw. I could stay here. We might all day with you, Melanie. But a
I'm,
word,
I'm sure I'm sure I could too.
I know, but
I
life
mean,
world
for
is having
me, talking about astrology is one of the things I love best in my life,
Oh,
truly.
well, I'm mesmerized. And every time as you speak something else, it's like, but I've said that to guess, it feels like as we're being guided, like our two grandmothers upstairs, there's like what you called with that book, The Pulse of Life. I feel I'm just sometimes, all the time, I'm pulsing out or guided to pulse out an invitation to someone. And they
Yes,
reply
yes.
sometimes like nearly they were waiting for me. And then it's just like a pulsing over and back of not knowing whatever it's meant to be. And then that echoes
Yes.
out into the big web is every time I sit down, I sort of feel it. Um,
Yeah.
but just one other question on that that keeps, I don't know why it's just coming to me. It's this word about the exiled parts of ourselves. Is that Black Moon Lilith or the furthest part of the moon? That in these dark times, the darkness you're saying is we're back
Yes.
and, reflecting and maybe something comes in that was part of our life too, that maybe is coming back. But
Yes.
it
Yes.
strikes me that there are parts of myself as well, and someone drew my attention to it when I called the podcast Wild Woman. I didn't know consciously. It was another astrologer, and she pointed out that I'd Lilith opposite Neptune in my natal chart. So she said, I'm not surprised you called your podcast that. It's like, you know, because I felt that calling before. I didn't connect any of this. Like, but is there something in that? It feels like in that space, in that darkness, in that void or whatever, there are parts of us that maybe want to come back that we, was
Yes.
suppressed or
Yeah,
exiled.
absolutely. You
Mm.
know, just going back to what I said about Dane Rudyhar and the zodiac, he talks about the day force and the night force. So the day force concerns our social world out there with people, our busy lives in society, in terms of all kinds of relationships and so forth. And then the night force concerns our solitary communing with our own soul, so to speak. And so from that point of view, there is a kind of implicit relationship between the night force or the dark force, as Rudyard described it, and many different kinds of activities whereby our unconscious has more space to speak, where things that we have left behind can return, where stuff we may have jettisoned from within by circumstance or by choice, and they can come back. Indeed, absolutely. And so there is a wildness about that because it's the untamed, organic, natural, spontaneous part of us that lives in the dark, so to speak, meaning away
Mm.
from the world, away from society. So that's kind of endemic in the image, if you see what I mean.
Yes. But it strikes me then that that's sort of the germ or the seed for what will spring forth the new if we all retreat to that place then and nurture
Ex-
it. It'll
exactly right.
it'll
Exactly
spring.
right.
Yeah. So that's a beautiful, thank you. It's a beautiful reminder to me, and I'm sure all of you listening that it's a very special time then. And
I think so.
as
I think
difficult
so.
as yeah, it's all going on at once, as you said. It's the best
Yes,
and the
it
worst
is.
of times, all it.
Yes, because I've only focused on just the cycle of
Yeah,
Saturn and Neptune.
yes.
But in these very few years around now, there are other planets as well, loads of them actually,
All,
which
yeah.
are entering new signs, entering a new part of their cycle. And another thing I'll mention, just because it comes to mind, and I haven't heard anybody else speaking about it, although that doesn't mean that they aren't out there speaking about it. But in the cycle of planets going retrograde or direct, this is to me so interesting because we're in a phase of time now, and I actually haven't done the research to know how long, But certainly these few years, I would say maybe as much as 10 years and ongoing, but getting less. The whole shape of each year is the same, in the sense that almost all of the planets, except the really much more faster moving ones like Venus and Mercury, there are periods when the whole lot are all going direct, and then all of them turn within a relatively short space of time, and they go retrograde and they backtrack. And then they all turn again within a fairly short space of time, and then they will go, wow. Now, my felt sense of this is it intensifies everything, because, it's not always like that. But in these few years around now, it is. And if you look at one of those graphs which track the movement of the planets, you can see it in a second. You can see, oh my God, it's like a shoal of fish.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're all going one way, and then they all get turned back, and then they will go forward. So where we're at in that now, the period of time where they all turn is gradually sort of getting wider, and in that sense reducing some of the intensity, but it is still very noticeable.
Mm.
And you won't see that in every single year. Sometimes they're going every which way, retrograde and direct, and they're not lining up with each other, but at the moment they really are. And especially around their turning points, you get a blast of intensity. Right now it's within about a month that at least 3 of them turn. But any more than that, and wow.
There's no resisting anymore, is there?
Exactly. Yes.
As much as we want to, this idea of letting go, I can just see hanging on at the edge of the cliff and
Yes.
being whipped away.
Yes.
You can glue yourself to it, but
Yes.
oh my
Ah.
God, what is that? Let go or be? I've heard different things that let go or be dragged or something to that effect.
Well, there's that one kind of pun where they say, "Let go and let God."
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think
I prefer
that's
that
a
one.
that's a big one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is a big
but
one. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
but
Well,
really, that is what it's all about.
it is, isn't it? Well, I know what you say about the letting go. I remember with when I got the diagnosis of cancer, and before that, I had been full throttle, a million things, control, keep everything going. And
Mm,
there was just one day, and it was great. I mean, there's nothing else for it. I remember sitting in the car driving to an appointment and planning now, when that's finished and that treatment, I'll do this. I was all still in my work sort of, and something, so I couldn't even just, other than my whole body just went, I was in the car and my hands came off the wheel, and there was just this breath, and something in me knew. I always say it was like someone just cracked open this big cage on my head, and there's no word still for it. I can't
yeah,
even,
yeah,
the crack in it unfolded, but yeah, but it took what it took for, I wouldn't say I let go. Like you said, over time. So it's it's good to be reminded that we can at least try and we can support ourselves maybe, or bring a consciousness to what is happening maybe,
yeah.
or so, because we don't know.
And also, I think be very tender and kind when we notice the parts of us that are resisting
Mm,
or that are cramping up against the letting go, um, rather than getting self-judgmental and negative and telling yourself you shouldn't be doing that. You're supposed to be letting go and all of that.
yeah, yeah. Thank you, Melanie. I really appreciate your time today. Um,
Thank you. I'm sure we could have gone on all day, but anyway.
I know, I know. I don't know how much in the busy world that we live in, but but I think people dip in and out. I often say that. I go, sometimes the podcast goes longer, but I know myself and I'm very interested. We're all finding what we're called to. It's like whatever I love
Yeah,
these words, what's burnished on your soul, and you just trust that discernment of what you're drawn to. I used to be, I
yeah.
have to read and see and learn everything. But
Yes, yes.
I'm giving up on that. There's too much,
Oh,
too much.
well done.
Finally, but being called to what enriches my life, hopefully. So I know that this podcast will enrich listeners' lives as it has mine, spending this time with you. So I'm very grateful.
Well, it's been wonderful just
Mhm.
spending the time talking with you. Thank you so much.
And thank you, grannies.
Yes, thank you, grannies.
Thank you, grannies, and with their cup of tea. They're getting tired now, and time to
Yeah,
go
they
home.
need a nap, I think.
Need a nap. And for any, for not for anyone, but Melanie, if people want to get in touch with you, or do you welcome people making contact, or to find your books or any of your work and your writing? What's the
So I
best way?
do I do have a website which is just my name,
Mhm.
melanie.reinhart.com. And I confess uh, lots is quite out of date. And the website would really need a major overhaul to kind of bring it up to speed. But I guess, during these times, I've been more or less content to just, long as it serves some purpose, I'll leave it as it is. But yeah, contact information is there. I'm not able to take any new clients at the moment for readings. Uh, I regret that. It's just I was getting overwhelmed with too many requests that I just couldn't keep up with. um, I do
Thank
have a
you.
mailing list and write occasional newsletters. So, for example, I will put the link
Thank you. Hmm.
of our conversation that will go into a newsletter.
Mhm.
And sometimes there are freebies and discounts and various things like that.
And you're quite active, I know, on YouTube for anyone even who just wants to, you do a lot of
Oh,
interviews
I
and
do.
you, I
I've just
love
been,
watching them. Yeah.
well, I've been so lucky, fortunate, grateful because all these lovely people have invited me onto their podcast channel, something I probably never would have done
Really.
myself. You know, I'm not that much of a techie. I don't have any, prejudice about it or anything. I'm just not very techie and have just had way too much going on to initiate a big project like that myself. But that's an example of, well, I didn't do that, even though I sort of thought I should be doing that. I didn't do it. And then I got all these lovely invitations
You don't
to
need to do
cut to come on other
it.
people's podcast channels, which I've been thrilled about and, had lovely conversations with people. So yeah,
Yeah.
there are loads of them out there now.
Yeah, highly recommend. I really would. It's just you immerse yourself in the energy of you and the guests, and there's a beautiful sacred circle I came upon again for anyone who might want to check it out on YouTube, that you're in with a number of other ladies,
Oh yes, the
it's
Soul Wisdom
Martha
Circle. Mm.
Hines, is it? And
Yes,
beautiful astrologers and other women doing different things in the world, and it's just phenomenal. It's a beautiful space to enter because you're joining this circle. So if it's
yes,
something that calls you and isn't available physically near where you are, it is available. That's it's I could feel it. That's the thing. Even though I don't
right.
spend
That's
your
lovely.
yeah. You don't have to,
Yeah,
we don't want to spend our lives online, but if there was any doubt that energy is transmitted in this,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
in no doubt.
Absolutely. Yes, we meet about once every 3 months or so,
Yeah.
roughly coinciding with the solstices and equinoxes, but
Mhm.
not exactly, but roughly.
Yeah. So plenty to watch and read. And so everyone, thank you so much for listening and watching. And thank you, Melanie. Very grateful for your time today. And who
Thank
knows, there may
you.
be a
Thank
part
you.
two in the sometime when Granny calls again.
Yes.
We'll listen. Take care, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Okay, then.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thanks for staying with us.